Discover the secrets of the Gua Experiment, an amazing story of interspecies psychology and behavior. Intrigue and mystery surround one of the most unusual experiments in the history of psychology, the Gua Experiment. Have you ever wondered what happens when a chimpanzee is raised in a human family as a child? This is exactly the scenario that psychologist Winthorp Kellogg and his wife, Luella, created in the 1930s in an ambitious attempt to explore the limits of interspecies behavior and learning. The story begins with Gua, a female chimpanzee, and Donald, the psychologist's 10-month-old son. In an era when research ethics were different, Kellogg decided to try something extraordinary by raising a chimpanzee alongside his own son to observe how each developed in the other's presence. What happens when a human child and a chimpanzee are raised together in the same conditions? How does each species influence the development of the other? Gua's experiment had surprising results. Although Gua surpassed the child in almost every area of development except language, his influence on little Donald was profound. The boy began to adopt animal behaviors, communicating through growls and howls. These findings raised important questions about the nature of learning, adaptability, and interspecies influence. The experiment was not only a study of development, but also a window into a deep understanding of human and animal nature. At a time when psychology was trying to unravel the enigma of feral children and human development, Kellogg offered a new and challenging perspective. How is human behavior formed in the presence of a completely different species? What are the limits of adaptation and learning among species? The Gua Experiment, the psychologist who raised a chimpanzee as his child. It is not only the story of an unusual experiment, but also a meditation on human nature, adaptability, and the mysteries of behavior. This unique study has had a significant impact on psychology and ethology, changing the way we think about learning and development. Follow this incredible story and discover how a chimpanzee and a human child together wrote a fascinating chapter in the history of behavioral science. Winthorp and Luella Kellogg wanted to know how wild children really live, but as it would be unethical to raise a child in the forest, they decided to raise a chimpanzee alongside their 10-month-old son. Christened Gua, the chimpanzee surpassed the child in almost all areas of development, apart from language, and influenced him so much that the psychologist's son also began to communicate through growls and howls. The experiment took place in the early 1930s and lasted 9 months. Ever since he was a student, Winthorp Kellogg had been fascinated by feral children. There were already well-documented cases, stories of children raised by animals in the wild, without any human influence, who failed to adapt to civilization after coming into contact with it. Kellogg had already been working as a psychologist for years when he decided to analyze in more detail what happens in the mind of a child raised by other species and how it develops. Some of Kellogg's concerns concerned the intelligence of children raised in the wild. At the time, the assumption was that all so-called feral children had a low IQ, but Kellogg argued that this was not true. If that were true, Kellogg claimed, the child would not have survived. The psychologist argued that at the beginning of life there is a period of experiences and learning that forms a being for the rest of its existence. Kellogg set out to prove it. But since raising a child in the wild and surreptitiously observing him would have been a project of questionable ethics, he decided to approach things differently. He decided to raise a chimpanzee as he would raise a child, and he was going to go all the way. Previous attempts had been made to teach chimpanzees to use human language, but all had failed. Kellogg decided that he would not only work with the chimpanzee during working hours. He was going to raise a chimpanzee with Donald, his almost 1-year-old son. Winthorp Kellogg and his wife, Luella, adopted Gua, a female chimpanzee about 7 months old. The chimpanzee would be part of their family day and night. The family would dress him, feed him, and play with him as if he were a human. The chimpanzee was to be cared for as if it were the couple's biological child. For 9 months, the Kelloggs kept Gua with Donald, frequently putting them both through a series of tests that gauged their development. From memory, reflexes, play behavior to listening and language and attention skills, the two's development had been carefully planned in what must have been an exhausting experiment. The two Kellogg's were conscientious, and their observations were thorough. They even described the sound of a spoon hitting their son's head compared to the sound of a spoon hitting the chimpanzee's head. Finally, the results obtained proved interesting. Gua never mastered language, but Donald's babbling became rather atypical as he tried to imitate the sounds made by his adopted sister. At first, the child imitated the sounds of the chimpanzee. Later, he used those growls and howls in an attempt to communicate, just like the chimpanzee did. Gua surpassed his human brother in many ways. She learned to feed herself more quickly and was able to perform certain tasks more successfully. Gua took the lead when it came to exploring new places and handling objects seen for the first time. Speech and language, real speech and word formation were the only things Donald had learned faster. Gua was also physically bigger than Donald, and perhaps the Kellogg's feared that the animal had become too strong to play with the boy. Concerned that their son might copy too much of the animal's behavior, the Kellogg's decided to end the experiment after 9 months. There was also the fear that Donald's development might have been slowed down by too much influence exerted by the chimpanzee on the child. Finally, the Kellogg's were able to form a perspective on the developmental years that feral children go through. They documented the study in the book The Ape and the Child and returned Gua to the center from which she was adopted. Sadly, less than a year after being separated from her brother, Gua died of pneumonia, but her impact on the field of psychology is noted and appreciated even today. In the shadow of the decision to end the experiment, the Kellogg family home fell into silence and melancholy. What kind of life awaited Gua, now separated from the only family she had ever known? As the door closed behind her, her gaze seemed to ask, "Why must I go?" Little Donald's heart was beating restlessly, crying out for his lost sister. Will he ever be able to forget the days spent together learning from each other? At the research center, Gua seemed a shadow of her former cheerful self, a sign that the separation had left a deep wound. Looking through the bars, maybe she was dreaming of the days she spent with Donald, their games, the warmth of a hug. Did she understand the fate that was given to her? Did he feel that something precious had been taken from him? And what happens to little Donald? Will he be able to find his voice in a world without Gua? Will he always search in vain for that lost connection, that common language that only the two of them shared? The end of this experiment leaves more questions than answers. Can the species boundary really be crossed? What sacrifices are necessary in the name of science, and how deeply can they hurt? The story of Gua and Donald remains a heartbreaking chapter in our quest to understand the complex relationship between man and nature.